Death and danger lurk around every corner in the post-apocalypse. Strap your gas mask on tight and always remember, if it's hostile, you kill it. We're rewinding back to 2010 for a look at Metro 2033. Fear the future. These are the words that greet you on the startup of Metro 2033, and if the future ends up anything like this, then they're words to live by. Developed by 4A Games, 2033 is a, let's say, difficult first-person shooter set in a post-nuclear war Russia. It was a standout title in the backlog of THQ's published games before they went out of business, and has gone to gain a decent reputation for itself over the years. In 2013, there was the release of a sequel with Metro Last Light, followed a year later with Redux versions of both games, improving visual quality as well as base mechanics. The use of the word Metro for the first part of the title is no accident, as most of the time players will find themselves navigating through the dark depths of Moscow's underground rapid transit system, or at least what's left of it. The game is loosely based on a very Russian book by the same name, written by a very Russian Dmitry Gluskovsky, whose very Russian name I hope I said somewhat correctly. Books crossing mediums with electronic entertainment is nothing new, with many having done so before, for better or for worse. Some end up as worthwhile additions to a franchise, while others come out as Eisenhorn Xenos. Ugh.
Eisenhorn? Gregor, is that you?
If Hollywood is anything to go by, it's not easy to port the written word to a visual medium, let alone an interactive one. Trying to make a story fit the runtime of a film can be rather difficult, and while games don't have as much in the way of time limitations as movies do, they definitely have their own problems. Luckily, 4A Games had the opportunity to work with the original author, who, while not writing the game's story, did help them create a faithful adaptation to the source material, even if it's not exactly the same. This meant that 2033 was able to really capture not only the basic plot of the books, but also its tone and world building to flesh out the game and make it stand out from its contemporaries. After all, this isn't the first time something has used the post-apocalypse or post-apocalyptic Russia in particular for its setting, let alone when it comes to video games. A few years prior to Metro 2033's release in 2007, GSC Game World released the open-world first-person survival horror shooter Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl, a game in post-apocalyptic Russia based on a film from 1979 called Stalker, which in of itself was based on the book Roadside Picnic. A short time before Shadow of Chernobyl was finished, however, a group of its developers split off to form 4A Games and work on Metro. It's unknown as to why the split happened, but it's an odd coincidence that both games not only shared some of the same developers, but also similar settings and ideas while being based off of Russian literature. Even though there are plenty of similarities on the surface, both projects ended up being very different products, with almost the exact opposite take on their ideas. The Stalker series is all about exploring large open landscapes littered with warring factions that mostly take a backseat to its narrative. Metro, on the other hand, is more of your standard post-Half-Life first-person shooter, having a specific A to B path for players to navigate as well as a large emphasis on story. That's not to say one kind of game is specifically better or worse than the other, since each fits the books they're based on. After all, it can be difficult to get away from concrete rooms and corridors and an underground subway station, since the setting automatically causes limitations in level design. But why are you in the Metro in the first place? 2033's setup isn't something people haven't seen before. 20 years before the game takes place, nukes were dropped on the city of Moscow, killing everyone trapped above ground. Thankfully, Russia had some kind of plan in case such a thing happened, and quickly hurdled as many people into the bunker-like metro system throughout the country. Players take on the role of one of these so-called lucky citizens who survived the blast, named Artyom. Even though a good amount of time has gone past since the bombs fell, new threats have begun to emerge. Mutants and bandits have made traveling throughout the tunnels a difficult thing to do, which is a problem because that's exactly what Artyom sets out to do on his own. Artyom's home station, called Exhibition, has begun being affected by strange beings called the Dark Ones. Beings that aren't openly hostile, but have the effect of making humans lose their minds. No one's quite sure what to do about them. The only plan anyone has is to get in contact with a group called the Rangers who live in a station called Polis, with the hope that they can somehow do something to put an end to it. Secretly, Artyom takes on this quest, but there wouldn't be much of a story if everything went along smoothly. It's not long before Artyom finds himself up against some of the worst threats this new world has to offer, both in and outside of the metro. Can he make it to Polis? Will the Rangers help Exhibition with the Dark Ones? And why is it that Artyom doesn't seem to be affected by them the same way everyone else is? Even though there's a limited amount of humans left within the metro system, 2033 constantly plays with the ideas of unity and ideology. Most people just want to live out their lives as best they can, but there are factions out there with much bigger plans, specifically the Communist Reds and the Nazis. I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of weird to see Russian Nazis, especially since this game takes place far after World War II. But both them and the Reds have their own vision of what humanity should be in order to rise from the ruins of the old world and rule anew. And neither one can see eye to eye with each other. They spend about as much time warring with themselves as they do anything else and cause a lot of trouble for general citizens. It's obvious that neither side has learned much from the destruction of the previous world, which is a theme carried throughout the entire story. Enemies also like to chat with each other while just standing around, and it's a good idea to listen in on their conversations to help get an idea of what's going on in the world of Metro, as well as learning about supply stashes or even secondary routes through different areas. There's no siding with either faction to easily slip past them, and both groups are well stocked with weapons, meaning that sometimes it's just best to avoid them outright.
The party teaches that only the communist doctrine can show the true path through the tunnels. Only in the name of Lenin can we restore the glory of our metro and humanity.
While Artyom may have grown up in the metro, he's mostly stayed in one location, leading to the landscape that he's traveling being both foreign and familiar at the same time. While many of the stations he comes across are reminiscent of Exhibition, and tunnels tend to basically look the same, the overall hostility of what lives there, both human and not, are things he's only heard in stories and not experienced for himself. This helps put Artyom and players in the same shoes, as they're both introduced to the world at large at the same time. That is, when 2033 isn't too busy telling you about it. While the game is split between combat and non-combat sections, many instances of both involve other characters constantly talking at you. There are only a few sections where the game leaves you alone to navigate the world yourself. For the sake of story and narration, Artyom constantly finds himself in the company of slow-walking and long-talking NPCs he has to escort throughout the tunnels. Going from one section where the game lets its players do as they wish to take things as quickly or as slowly as they want, to another section where they have to wait for someone to open doors for you gets really annoying rather quickly. There are very few exceptions to this where other characters are welcome, such as in defense sequences where extra guns are always nice to have, and NPCs do a fairly decent job in defending themselves. After all, why shoot your bullets to kill enemies when someone else can shoot theirs for the same result? The biggest problem with escorting NPCs is to try to figure out what's a scripted event and what isn't. It's easy to waste bullets fighting enemies that can't be killed due to them needing to do something specific to advance the game. Being set in the post-apocalypse, bullets can be a commodity that's difficult to come by, so you only really want to use them if you absolutely have to. 2033 has many different difficulties to pick from that affect everything from the amount of ammo and items scattered throughout the game to how much damage Artyom can take or even how much of information the game gives players. Higher difficulties make enemies do more damage but make your attacks more powerful as well to help balance things out. The biggest problem is getting into fights in the first place. There are two ways to tackle challenges in 2033. Full-on bullets-blazing assault, or a more stealthy approach. Fighting mutants usually involves killing as much as you can as fast as you can, but it only takes a few firefights with humans to realize how 2033 really wants you to play it. Since Artyom is a rather fragile and squishy human being on most difficulties, stealth is almost always the best option, which is kind of a problem. 2033's stealth system leaves a lot to be desired and is kinda broken, or at least mostly unfair. It's important to keep in mind not only if you're visible to enemies, but also if they can hear you. Moving while crouched reduces how audible players' footsteps are, but you still gotta keep an eye out for glass fragments and various alarms that will give away your position. Light is also very important in the Metro. Most light sources can be put out if you get close enough to them or destroyed if shot, although doing so may draw some unwanted attention. Artyom has a special watch that gives him some insight onto how visible he is, but I still found it easy to get spotted when I thought I was safe. 2033 doesn't have any kind of leaning mechanic to peek around corners, meaning it's very possible to pop around one right into the view of an enemy and right into the front of a gun. Enemies have the magical ability to know exactly where you are pretty much all the time once an alarm goes off, regardless of where they are or if they should have been able to notice you in the first place. Once one person sees you, they all see you, and they do a pretty good job at pinpointing your location with a wall of bullets and grenades. Staying behind cover is really the only option for staying alive. 2033 has a slight amount of regenerating health depending upon the difficulty you're playing on, with the higher levels forcing players to rely only on health packs to stay in the world of the living. Due to this, getting caught in many situations is a death sentence, and the game only has automatic checkpoints to fall back on for when Artyom bites the dust. I really only found a few strategies that were useful in avoiding these almost no-win situations. You see, if a human enemy doesn't die in one hit, they'll cry out and almost always alert everyone else in a nearby area. Alerted enemies never stop till they've killed you or are killed themselves, so if you get caught, there's no real way to go back to straight-up stealth. There are many different variations for weapons within the game, from multiple scopes to different barrel attachments and silencers that give you some kind of an option, but these weapons rarely kill in one hit. Many times throughout the game, I felt as if my bullets were being ignored by enemies, meaning that normal firearms were very unreliable for staying unnoticed. Instead, I found myself relying on throwing knives, since one knife is generally all it takes to take someone out. They don't make any noise, can be thrown rather quickly, and can even be recollected and reused. The only other weapon that's like this in the game is a makeshift revolver called the Helsing. It uses a pneumatic system to quietly fire arrows and does so rather quickly. Arrows, like knives, can usually deal with enemies in 1 or 2 hits, as well as being able to be recollected and reused, which makes both options favorable to one-time use bullets. Really, bullets are best saved to be used up against mutants, such as pulling out a nice double-barrel shotgun to deal with anything that comes up against you. There is a melee system in the game, but it's not a great alternative most of the time. 2033 doesn't have any kind of up-close and personal takedown move to kill enemies with your melee weapon in one quick stroke. So the most you can do is kinda just stab at them and hope they don't make any noise. While it's ill-advisable to bring a knife to a gunfight, things fare much better against basic mutants, even though they require players to get within damage range to use melee attacks. I found myself really relying on these three means of reusable attacks: throwing knives, helsing arrows, or just your basic stabbing and punching in order to save my bullets for when I really needed them. And you're really gonna need them in some situations. For some reason, 4A Games decided to include multiple holdout sections throughout Artyom's journey in the Metro, which really don't play to the game's strengths. After all, there's no way to stealthily deal with a horde of mutants running at you. While humans are prevalent within the Metro, there are sequences where Artyom gets to travel across the surface and through the remains of the now-dead city of Moscow. The outside world is encased in a nuclear winter and full of poisonous air. It's quickly made obvious that humans no longer rule this world and really don't belong here, with packs of mutants lining the streets and flying demons taking over the skies. Dead Moscow also plays into some of the more supernatural elements of the game. Something about how the nukes went off and how many people were killed by them in such a short period of time seems to have broken reality. Shadows replay the events that led to their death over and over and over again, seemingly trapped in an endless loop of madness while attempting to make anyone who gets too close join them in the cycle, while echoes of the old world ring through the ruins above. It really helps get across just how dangerous the world of Metro is now and how there really is no going back to how things were before. The only way to stay alive out here is being attentive to your surroundings and keeping a fresh air filter in your mask. Filters are easy enough to find and can even be bought if you find yourself running low, but gas masks have their own caveats to them. Players can put the mask on and take it off whenever they want to, and taking damage with one on will cause it to start to crack. Too much damage and the thing will flat out break, which is really flippin' bad if you find yourself outside. Thankfully, there are a good amount of masks to find around the game to swap with if yours is close to breaking, but it does make one more thing for you to keep your eye on when caught in a fight. As the game goes on, humans do begin to show up more often in these outside areas, which can get a bit dicey, since unlike lanterns and lights in the Metro, you can't exactly put out the sun, making you very visible to anything with a gun. Artyom can only carry 3 weapons with him at a time: a pistol, an automatic, and some kind of heavy weapon with many different weapons using different kinds of ammo. Some weapons are just flat out better or worse than the others, with the starting SMG being just a pile of garbage, and something you want to replace as quickly as possible. While there's a good amount of stuff to find lying around if you're resourceful enough or don't mind looting corpses, bullets can also be exchanged at different stations throughout the Metro. Vendors also trade in weapons and consumable items, but it's important to make sure you keep in mind what you have to trade with them in the first place. In the society of the Metro, money has become useless, and traders instead are only interested in ammo. But not just any ammo, military-grade ammo. Compared to the repurposed stuff manufactured in the Metro, military-grade ammo is a lot more powerful and very limited in supply. If it comes down to it, the stuff can be used to kill enemies in a pinch, but it can only be used for automatic weapons, and it does mean you're shooting your money away. Trading for manufactured rounds or weapons with vendors is kind of pointless anyway, since there's a good amount of both to collect just by doing a bit of searching. It's kind of ridiculous how many dead bodies litter the world that are ripe for looting. Somehow, Artyom just so happens to end up going through areas after someone else was already there, leaving stuff just for him to find. Every human enemy also has a gun of some kind that they drop upon death, along with their own amount of loot. So even on higher difficulties, supplies aren't super difficult to come across as long as you don't waste them like an idiot. It's much more important to hold on to military rounds or trade ammo for weapons you aren't using for them in order to buy different armor sets throughout the game, unless you really want to ratchet up the challenge for yourself. Even with the broken stealth system and seemingly spotty hit detection, I wouldn't say 2033 is an overly difficult game, but just that it's an unfair one. Multiple times the game just won't tell you about important information, such as this one hallway full of exploding orbs of death. I found myself hitting a brick wall here as I couldn't keep either myself nor the guy I had to escort alive long enough to get through it, before a tip on a loading screen told me that I could shoot and destroy the things that made the orbs. With how much the game likes to talk, it would have been easy enough for someone in there to tell me these things were even killable. Personally, I was only focusing on taking out the death orbs before they exploded and never even realized you could shoot the things that they were coming out of. The game also has some technical issues. For some reason, 4A games decided to go with a vertical field of view instead of a horizontal one, and omitted a way to change it in-game. By default, the FOV is pretty low, and while it can be changed through configuration files, it quickly causes animations and visuals to look a bit weird since they weren't made for anything but the default. I found an FOV of 65 to be the best balance between visuals and the game actually running, since on many settings the thing would just crash on startup, and if it's too high, things can get very warped and weird. There are also instances of poorly placed checkpoints, leaving players to be caught in death loops, or even enemies that glitch out when they die, making for some weird situations. Many of 2033's problems were addressed in its sequel, Metro Last Light, a few years later, and then improved upon even more with the release of 2033 Redux in 2014. Redux had the goal of not only updating 2033 to run on a newer version of the game engine, complete with a visual overhaul, but also to take ideas and systems from Last Light and port them over. Upon release, there was a bit of an argument whether or not Redux's visuals were really an improvement over the original or not. Some said that Redux lacked the same amount of detail in many areas, but one look at the wasteland of dead Moscow is enough for me to say the game still looks pretty dang great regardless. I can also say that, without a doubt, its stealth system is an overall improvement. Not only do enemies no longer alert everyone when they happen to catch you, but silenced weapons are actually useful. Bullets seem to register the way they're supposed to when they hit an enemy, and Artyom now has two separate takedown moves. One that kills, and one that just knocks enemies out. There really doesn't seem to be much of a reason to use one over the other, however. Metro has an odd morality system that determines which ending players will get when they finish the game. A good one, and a bad one. While the bad ending is considered closer to the original source material, it's an ending that you really have to actively go after to get. Positive or negative morality sometimes seems to be awarded at random. Giving beggars money or just ignoring them has obvious effects, since helping them out is seen as a good thing to do. But other times, positive morality can just be gained by visiting a specific location or using specific interactables. Whenever anything happens related to morality, there's a small flash on the screen followed by some kind of weird sound effect, so you always know when things happen, but not always know why. There's no way to see what your morality is at any given time, but I found myself gaining positivity for it just by basically playing through the game, regardless of what I was doing. Which ending you get only affects the final cutscene, as the good one lets players decide the fate of the dark ones, where the bad one just makes the decision for you. Artyom's interaction with these beings makes for some of the most interesting visuals in the game, and builds on the story's supernatural and possibly extraterrestrial themes, but I really wish 4A had done a bit more with the morality mechanic. It would be interesting if people would change how they treated Artyom based on what his morality was, was, or something along those lines, but the game never really goes that far. You can't kill non-hostile humans anyway, so no matter what, there's no way to really play as an evil character. I can only guess that such a thing would be too far removed from the structure of the original book. Redux also brings some odd level design changes to 2033, along with some new ways to play it. There are 2 extra settings to pick from when starting a new game: Survival Mode or Spartan Mode. Survival aims to be more like the original release of 2033, with less supplies and smarter AI, while Spartan is more focused on firefights. All of the different options do a great job of letting players pick how they want to play the game and just how much of a challenge they want to deal with. While I played through the original 2033 on hardcore, I can't really see myself playing on it anything harder due to the game's unfair feeling jankiness. I went through Redux on Spartan Ranger difficulty though, and had a really enjoyable time. The removal of things like the heads-up display as well as other subtle changes made the game feel a lot more immersive. Redux also brings changes to the game's weapon system, since instead of having 3 separate slots for different types of weapons, players now have 2 slots that can be used for anything. You can even carry 2 of the same weapon if you want, although keep in mind that you'll use twice as much of the same ammunition doing so. There's also a change to how equipment is used, since instead of selecting and then throwing it, there's only a button for throwing it. It's not a change I particularly like, since the animation for things such as throwing knives takes longer, meaning that they can't be used as quickly as they were before. But there is a new firebomb grenade that was brought over from Last Light, so that's at least something. Vendors have also been changed around to be a bit more useful. Instead of just trading for weapons, items, and ammunition, vendors can now be used to customize weapons. Previously, the only way to find weapons with a silencer or a specific sight was to pick it up off the ground. Vendors did sell weapons with attachments on them, but it's only in Redux where players can pick which ones they want, if any. There's also been the inclusion of a few new weapons with a smaller variant of the basic AK-47 and a homemade automatic shotgun that looks neat and feels great to shoot. 4A did a pretty good job fixing up 2033 with Redux, even expanding on exploration with the addition of keys to find to unlock vaults full of supplies. The game isn't perfect though, as it still doesn't have a way to change the FOV in-game, and there are a good amount of visual glitches here and there throughout the game. Still, with its improved stealth mechanics, I find it really difficult to go back. Plus, Redux has kind of completely replaced 2033 on digital storefronts, making any other version of the game a lot more difficult to get your hands on. However you decide to play the game, you're still in for a pretty good time if you happen to enjoy modern first-person shooters with a side of difficulty to them. Metro 2033 presents both an interesting world as well as a good challenge. While it's a bit hand-holdy, full of escorting NPCs as well as having rather straightforward level design, few games are able to create as realized of a world that 2033 does. 4A is really able to make use of tension to keep things interesting throughout 2033's runtime, although Artyom does find himself squeaking out of near-death situations a little bit too often to be believable, and there always just so happens to be somebody nearby to save him if he needs it. The game has its fair share of problems with ideas that I really wish were expanded upon, but that's what sequels are for, and 2033 was only based off of the first book in the series. There's the potential for the developers to get a lot more out of Metro's world, but just how much they can squeeze from the dark tunnels under Moscow is another question. Thanks for watching. Please let me know what you think of the game or this video in the comments section. I'm MegapiemanPHD, and I'll talk to you guys later. Want to see more of my stuff? click on the video on the left for friggin' awesome pans in video games, where I talk about some friggin' awesome pans you can find in video games. Or check out the video on the right for a quick peek at hover revolving